White initiates with establishing central presence and setting the stage for a dynamic contest. Black mirrors White's central control with maintaining equality and solidifying their position. White challenges the center with creating tension and seeking dynamic play. Black reinforces the center with opting for a solid queen's pawn setup. White develops the knight to a solid move aimed at controlling central squares. Black supports the center with preparing for central pawn advances. White centralizes the queen with preparing for potential pawn breaks and supporting pieces. Black develops the knight to a flexible move supporting pawn advances and piece coordination. The move the knight on the b-file to d2 by White is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to g3, claiming key space in the center. Paving the way for the knight on the g-file to f6, significantly boosting piece coordination. Which enables the bishop to g2 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. Whereby the bishop to d6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Unlocking short castles with highly aggressive threats. This allows the knight to e4, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the knight on the g-file to f6 by Black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to f5, claiming key space in the center. Paving the way for the pawn to g3, significantly boosting piece coordination. Which enables the bishop to d6 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. Whereby the bishop to g2 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Unlocking the knight on the g-file to f6 with highly aggressive threats. This allows short castles, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the pawn to g3 by White is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to e4, claiming key space in the center. Afterwards, the pawn on the d-file takes on e4 executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the knight takes on e4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the knight takes on e4, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the queen takes on e4 executes a favorable trade. Next comes the bishop to b4 with check, pushing the tactical tension to its limit. Black develops the bishop to, aiming to control key central squares and prepare castling. White develops the bishop to, completing the fianchetto and preparing for kingside defense. Black castles kingside, securing the king and preparing to connect the rooks. White castles kingside, a standard move aligning pieces for middle game play. The move the queen to e7 by Black is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the rook to e8, activating the rook on an open file. Paving the way for the rook to d1, significantly boosting piece coordination. Which enables the queen to e7 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. Whereby the rook to e1 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Unlocking the pawn to e5 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the pawn on the c-file takes on d5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. The move the pawn to e4 by White is a mistake. A superior alternative was the rook to e1, activating the rook on an open file. Paving the way for the pawn to e5, significantly boosting piece coordination. Continuing with the pawn on the c-file takes on d5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the pawn on the c-file takes on d5, liquidating material and gaining active play. Unlocking the pawn to e4 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the pawn on the d-file takes on e4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. Black recaptures with a solid move that simplifies the position and resolves central tension. White recaptures with, centralizing the knight and maintaining active piece play. Black exchanges knights, simplifying and reducing white's attacking potential. White recaptures with, centralizing the queen and keeping pressure on the board. Black advances, challenging white's central pawn structure and gaining space. The move the pawn on the d-file takes on e5 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the queen to c2, centralizing the queen to dominate the coordinates. Afterwards, the pawn on the e-file takes on d4, executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the knight takes on d4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure, whereby the queen to f6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the bishop to e3 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to f5, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black recaptures with, centralizing the knight and activating the piece. The move the knight to g5 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the bishop to d2, exerting diagonal pressure to limit the opponent's space. Afterwards, the knight takes on f3 with check, executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the queen takes on f3, compromising the opponent's pawn structure, whereby the bishop to e6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the bishop to c3 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the bishop to b4, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the knight to g6 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to g6, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the queen to c2, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the bishop to f5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the knight to e4 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the rook on the f-file to e8 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the rook to e1, guaranteeing long-term space control. White centralizes the queen with, maintaining piece coordination and control. Black advances, a solid defensive move to prevent further knight incursions. White moves the knight to, centralizing the knight and improving its scope. Black develops the bishop to, activating the bishop and creating counterplay. White repositions the rook to, activating the rook on an open file. Black mirrors white's rook development to, controlling the central file. White develops the bishop to, preparing to support pawn advances or trade pieces. Black repositions the rook to, controlling the d-file and preparing for action. White moves the queen to, putting pressure on black's queenside. Black develops the bishop to, centralizing the bishop and improving its influence. White moves the bishop to, challenging black's structure and piece placement. Black moves the queen to, centralizing the queen and preparing for further action. White advances, creating a pawn majority on the queenside and gaining space. The move the pawn to f5 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the bishop takes on e4, instantly capturing the target to simplify the board. Afterwards, the rook takes on e4, executes a favorable trade, which enables the bishop to d4 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the rook takes on e8 with check, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the rook takes on e8, executes a favorable trade. This allows the rook to d1, guaranteeing long-term space control. White develops the bishop to, aiming to control key diagonals. Black captures the bishop, simplifying the position and improving pawn structure. The move the rook takes on e4 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the bishop takes on e4, instantly capturing the target to simplify the board, paving the way for the knight to f8, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the bishop to f3 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the knight to d7 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the queen to a3 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the bishop takes on c3, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. Black captures the rook, forcing exchanges and simplifying the game. White recaptures with, consolidating the queen and maintaining piece activity. Black captures the rook, simplifying the position and aiming for an endgame. White recaptures with, maintaining piece presence and control. Black repositions the knight to, a solid defensive maneuver. White repositions the rook to, activating the rook and preparing for endgame play. The move the knight to e6 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the queen to d7, centralizing the queen to dominate the coordinates. Afterwards, the queen takes on f5, executes a favorable trade, which enables the queen to d2 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the queen takes on d2, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the rook takes on d2, executes a favorable trade. This allows the pawn to b4, guaranteeing long-term space control. White moves the bishop to, centralizing the bishop and creating threats. The move the knight to d4 by black is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the knight to f8, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost, paving the way for the bishop to g4, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the knight to h7 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the king to g2 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the knight to f6 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the bishop to f3, guaranteeing long-term space control. White captures the knight with, converting the material advantage into a winning position.